Welcome to Scholars in Spotlight. Today we have Melissa Sterry. She's returning for the second podcast in this series. We have recorded this conversation in two parts, and Melissa is a transdisciplinary design scientist and also complex system theorist. If you would listen to her first podcast, you'll notice that one of her main interests is that how to help humanity to build a better world. And in this conversation, you'll especially notice that she's been pulling strings from different disciplines to answer various different questions which I was asking. Above all, she's a lovely person to talk to and ask these kind of questions. So without further ado, let's welcome Melissa Sterry. So you are in France.
I'm in France, yes. I'm in southwest France.
Okay. I imagine, because you are a designer, I imagine your house would be like a treat to actually visit. So it might be really eccentric, kind of really weird architect's house. Am I correct? Or
No, I have my taste is it's not minimalist, but it is streamlined, as it were. But I have a lot of natural artifacts. So I have I've collected a number of specimens that relate to my work. And so I have, my family joke that it's like walking into the Natural History Museum. So yeah, there are a lot of specimens, which is mainly because, well, firstly, obviously they're useful from a scientific perspective. It's good to have the things that I am most interested in to hand, but also because sourcing of images of the various samples can actually be quite tricky. And some of the imagery that is out there, I'm not always happy with the aesthetics. So in having my own, it's obviously not quite as large as the Natural History Museum, or indeed many other collections, but I have what I need. And so yeah, there are lots of little bits of the natural world scattered around the house, and outside we're in a highly biodiverse area. And so I look out pretty much every day. I look out and I will see something interesting going on. And certainly if I take a walk and inspect we have the meadow. If I inspect the meadow, then I find all sorts of interesting bugs and flora and things going on. And I actually have a nature journal that I log down the species I find and what they're doing and so forth. So yeah, it's I walk my nature talk, as it were.
So, Melissa, last time we had a podcast in between the event, Future Cities event, if I'm correct.
That's right. Yeah.
In London, and that's a brilliant intro. If someone want to go back and listen a little bit about some of the aspects of your research and what your visions are around cities and our relationship with the environment. But what is your view on like nature in lockdown right now? How we are seeing that our relationship with the natural environment is probably maybe changing or evolving, or we are understanding it a little bit better?
It's an incredibly interesting period on many levels, because what this pandemic does is it illuminates the effectively the shortcomings, the problems within and of our current relations with the natural world. So at the most basic of levels, of course, while we know not quite what the origin of this particular virus is, and obviously there are various theories, and personally I think the probability that this came from, obviously we know it came from a wild species, but the probability that it effectively came to into our world, as it were, through the sort of processes that were actually very well portrayed in the film Contagion, and that have been discussed in various best-selling books by a number of etymologists and journalists that have studied the field. That being that effectively we're encroaching on the natural world. We are, for various reasons, be it poaching or wildlife trafficking, or logging, or simply carving roads and transport networks through virgin habitats or other. We're increasingly encroaching on the natural world, and because of that, we're coming into contact with more and more viruses. And I think that is most likely the route that this particular virus came along. But what it has highlighted is not just the problem there, but also the fact that more generally we are, we're keeping livestock, for example, in the factory farms, and we are distributing livestock. So, for example, in the wet markets, in ways that are very, very high risk to us as a species, and of course, in turn, to other species, and that these processes are reducing biodiversity, they are causing immense stress to ecological systems, and of course, they are deeply unethical. And so a big light has been shone on that. Also, of course, another really sad aspect of this development is that we have seen that deforestation is up by 65% in the Amazon so far, and that is because unscrupulous persons are taking advantage of the fact that the monitoring systems are not some aspects of those monitoring systems are not in play, i.e. the manpower on the ground that actually effectively implement the checks and the measures to try and keep deforestation down. We also today, this week, we've seen a report come out that has shown illegal raptor killings of peregrines and kites and various other species in the UK are up. And of course, we also see that poaching of rhino and the big five, amongst other species in Africa, is also up. So this has also shone a light on the fact that for all the communications, for all the data, for all the understanding within and of and beyond the scientific community, that we really have to protect biodiversity and protect species. There are they that, given half a chance, will exploit any disaster or any disruption to society. But again, juxtaposed against that, there is actually something very good and heartwarming, and that is the fact that whereas it has been species that have been contained, be that because we've been essentially we've been turning systems, we've been turning biomes that had been interconnected into islands, wherein species have been locked into ever decreasing circles of land, or within of our towns and cities, where some of our behaviours are actually inhibiting to other species, be it the extent of the noise pollution or the light pollution or the just general activity of humans. That has been reversed, wherein now it is not the species that are so much contained, but it is us. And the term I would give this is the human zoo. And that has brought about some very interesting developments, which it's somewhat difficult to actually quantify at the moment, because, of course, as with so many other facets of the online environment, there's lots of fake news. So, for example, the dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice, that has been debunked, and doubtless there will be, there's a lot of footage that is bouncing around that has no source of origin, let alone, date, place, or really anything that can actually substantiate the credibility of the footage. Now, again, there's a little bit of a sad aspect on that, in that actually to protect a lot of wildlife, you do actually need to obscure the source of the origin. So it's often important, particularly if it's a relatively rare species or a species that is vulnerable to human activity. You don't want to be too precise about quite where you saw that species and when and so forth, because obviously many species are very they're very habitual, they're very repetitive in their behavior, and so if you reveal the location and the time and so forth, you could actually be exposing the species to danger. But nonetheless, the anecdotal evidence, or not anecdotal evidence, but the anecdotal data, as it were, suggests that some really interesting things are occurring in terms of animal behavior in the built environment, in towns and cities, the interface there with, in that I have friends in the suburbs that are reporting, as have many others, that deer and other species are aggregating in greater numbers. They're being seen a little bit more often than they have for many years. So it is interesting, and the value in that will be variable, obviously, depending, first of all, on how well we quantify what has actually happened. And of course, with that, it will very much depend on people. In that, on the one hand, we're hearing a lot of individuals say, "Oh, goodness, well, being locked inside has made me realise how much I value the outdoors and how much I appreciate nature." But then the flip side of that is that human memory can actually be very short, and there is the very real possibility that, if a vaccine is developed and if treatments and so forth come into being, that effectively enable us to go back to living more or less as was, people could actually revert to precisely the same sort of behaviors, and we could not merely see the non-human life, as it were, see fauna retracting back to the places where it had effectively enclaved itself prior to the outbreak, but we could actually see a worse situation still, wherein, for example, animals that in the lockdown period, that across a period of months, have become used to populating human environments. They've been used, they've gotten used to coming into our towns or our cities, are then exposed to danger because, of course, the life cycles of these species are sometimes really very short. So with, if this lockdown or, the disruption to human or to built environments lasts, for sake of argument, 9 months, well, that is long enough for some species to have, been born, to have effectively become adult within of, their life term, and thereon to really know nothing else other than what they witnessed in the lockdown. And of course, species will adapt their behaviours to what they to the environments that they are used to. And so there are some dangers as well. But the crux of it is that, yes, this is shining a light on the worst and the best of humanity, and all the problems, but also all the possibilities of our future relationship with the natural world.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me when you were talking about that humans forget. It's from British, I think he's a journalist and a writer, Graham Hancock. He writes about ancient civilizations, that he says that
Mm,
humans is a species with amnesia. I mean, as a species, we
mm,
have amnesia. We just keep on forgetting our past,
mm,
and that's one of the reasons why we kind of go back to the same patterns. uh, Other than that, actually, you know how you mentioned that humans are now being locked, as they were somehow doing it to the other species. It's
mm,
like terraforming. You know how terraforming came
mm,
from science fiction
mm,
slowly, with Carl Sagan writing in 60s and 70s about somehow speculatively traveling in the space in some sort of a real way. And then in the sci-fi, you can see that how with the War of the World, one of the first times,
mm,
it was some other people coming. So
mm,
that imperialist colonialistic aspect of transforming, like the even in the fantasy, the urge is strong to even transform all the other planets, or the planet
mm,
they encounter, according to the human need. But
mm,
then in that story, the Martians came, and they were, of course, doing this to us.
mm. Look,
But so,
H.G. Wells,
yeah,
he was quite, Mars comes up a lot in H.G. Wells'
yeah,
writings. which is partly because, of course, at that time, astronomy was really, and studies of space in general were really starting to take off, but there were still many unknowns. And so their idea as to, and H.G. Wells' idea as to quite what could be happening on Mars was, seemingly today would seem rather ridiculous in
Mhm.
that, he and indeed many of his time thought that, there could very well be macro life on Mars as here on Earth. But actually, H.G. Wells, his work's very interesting because he effectively creates layers within his works. And so you can read in H.G. Wells' story, particularly the novellas and the longer works, on not one, but on several levels. And they were very, very much influenced by the work of Darwin and the advent of the theory of evolution. And the War of the Worlds is very much influenced by, of course, the fact that understanding the microbiology and of that which had not been seen effectively, H.G. Wells realized that this new frontier of human understanding was in recognizing that which we simply had not been aware of, or at least not formally aware of, in that, when you look back through ancient literature, you see all sorts of references to phenomena that suggests that there was, in fact, a much deeper awareness. But yes, that awareness was potentially forgotten. But the War of the Worlds is like many of H.G. Wells' books, very, very interesting to read. But in effect, the theatre, which is what he's really creating in that work, is, yes, it's set in a scientific and a virtual world, in a sort of avatar scenario wherein it is somehow deemed to be apart from the or his present world, the era in which he was writing. But in actual fact, there were a lot of references to what was going on. So the line between reality and fiction is somewhat thin, and it's obscured by the fact that, as do many writers, he was in effect cloaking ideas in fairly thinly disguised uh, form, in that he was,
Yeah.
the Martians, they, of course, that was speaking to a microbiological threat. And, that the notion of that was very much linked into the real events, and indeed to pandemics that had passed through and that he would have been aware of.
Yeah, so you, Melissa, you talks about, well, your work actually addresses a lot of what is the relationship between human systems and this highly complex Earth. So, I mean, so you're the perfect person to ask these questions, and that's, I just wanted to throw it in so that what conversation we had, it has a context to it. But you mentioned in one of your in your thesis about integrating fire. So
Mm.
I want to come back to the relationship between human systems and Earth, and what is your view on Gaia hypothesis. But I want to start from how, like, from one unit. So let's say, integrating fire. How do you see it?
Well, fire is it. To understand fire, firstly, Earth is the only planet in the solar system that has fire as such. In that, though one finds fiery phenomena on other planets, fire is, of course, a product of the burning of biomass, of basically carbon-based materials. In other words, fire cannot exist without life. The advent of fire on Earth is integral to the advent of life, in that when one traces back the evolution of life on Earth, one finds that fire came into that story very early on. And, essentially, I mean, when we look back through the ages, of course, we have a pretty accurate record of the way in which fire has manifested, both in terms of its geographic spread across the continents and across, and in terms of its intensity. So the reason for that is that fire is recorded in the fossil record, in that, we have this particular class of fossil, which is the fusane record, and it's charcoal to all intents and purposes, the charcoal record. And so we know that the relationship between fire and plant life is one of coevolution. It is one of coexistence. And to the extent that some species, and indeed many extant species, many of the species that remain here today, they don't just live with fire, but their reproductive processes are wholly dependent on fire. And that quality, that feature, that functional trait within their behavior, it stems right back to the origin of that species. And interestingly, though obviously, the fundamental theory of evolution is that species adapt, and therefore the species that are living today are, have to an extent adapted to what in effect are lower intensities, lower typical intensities and frequencies of fire than at some previous points in the record of life on Earth and in the history of life on Earth. So, for example, if we go back to the Carboniferous period, the gaseous composition of the atmosphere was different in that there was more oxygen, which in turn made the probability of combustion higher. And with that, there was a lot of plant matter. There was a lot of fuel, to use the term that you would in the fire sciences. And fires were raging, and they were raging at intensities and at scales that it would be actually quite difficult for us to picture today. And to give an idea of the extent to which they were raging, whereas today we think of a blue sky, and we're used to blue skies because essentially the particulates in our atmosphere are, we have less particulate matter in our atmosphere, and so effectively we have a clearer atmosphere. In the Carboniferous period, we would not have seen blue skies. We would have seen skies that were they were tinged with reds, with oranges, and with other colours, which were obviously a consequence of the fact that light was refracting off all these many particulate, all the many particles in the atmosphere from these constantly burning, raging fires. And so, fire is very much, it is one of the, along with water, this is not just the blue planet, it is the fiery planet. And that fundamental facet is not very well understood within many communities, that it's become somewhat lost. Now, I say within many communities because there was an ancient time when fire was very well understood by humans and indeed by our closest cousins, and not, backed by one, as it were, evolutionary generation, one other species of human, but of a number. And again, this is not hypothesis. This is evidenced by both anthropological and archaeological and indeed biological data. In that, this is actually written into our DNA. We have certain adaptations as a species that are not found in even our closest relatives within the chimpanzees. And fire is so fundamental to our development as a species that were it not for fire, and more specifically for our control of fire, this being something that, as I said, it dates back throughout not merely the entirety of the human lineage, but prior to that, we would not exist. And when I say we would not exist, our lineage would not exist. So we wouldn't be here. But fire, over the epochs, over the ages of human civilization, has become increasingly invisible in the minds of the many. And of course, part of that is to do with the fact, or indeed a large part of that is to do with the fact that in many cultures, and particularly the West, fire, though it undermines our society and every facet of it, and that obviously we are an industrialized, we are a species that is reliant on technology, and that is reliant on all of the processes that fire facilitates. So, for example, obviously, fire facilitates chemistry, fire facilitates the extraction and the modification of many materials. We would not be speaking now were it not for those many processes enabling the creation of the technology of the laptops and of the servers and of all the other things to enabling us to speak right now. We would not have this without fire. But fire is, as I said, is a very misunderstood phenomena. It is a very demonized phenomena. And in environments, many have in effect forgotten fire's role. And so theirs is not the awareness that there are species that are adapted to fire, species that would go extinct in its absence. Theirs is not the awareness that with regard to our management of fire, we do have options. We do have different ways in which we can work with fire. But at the end of the day, I was speaking to the Carboniferous, I was speaking to there being previous periods in which fire's behavior was in many ways much more dangerous than it is today. I mean, yes, we have big wildfire events, but, the point that I'm making here is that, yes, we have a certain degree of control over fire, but that the extent of that control is limited. And it is essentially limited, obviously, yes, to the gaseous composition of the atmosphere, although that, in the scheme of things, isn't going to change anytime soon. It is also very much impacted by temperature and by humidity, which, needless to say, at a time of climate change are changing. And that is a major contributing factor to, obviously, the fact that wildfires are now becoming more prevalent and they are becoming more frequent in some areas. And in other areas, they are not merely becoming more frequent, they're becoming more intense. So the manifestation of fire on Earth is changing. We have a very big part to play in that, and then there are all sorts of things that we are doing. And I've discussed them in detail in the thesis, but there are all sorts of things that we are doing that are yet further disrupting what are technically the current fire regime. So the typical behaviours of fire in the environment that have been prevalent within the Holocene, they are now shifting. And so really the thesis at its heart is drawing attention to the fact that there is this legacy and that, fire is fundamental to not merely our own existence, but to that of all life on Earth, or all terrestrial, not terrestrial life, all land life on Earth, rather. And that we have choices to make, we have decisions to make, and how and why we make them will obviously be very much a product of our understanding of the world about us. And that, of course, comes down to many, many factors, but amongst others, it comes down to our understanding of how and why we think the way that we do. And so another major facet of the thesis is looking to how other peoples think about fire, and not just ancient peoples from across many different cultures, but of course indigenous peoples. And when we looked at their understanding of the phenomena of fire on Earth, obviously, I mean, indigenous peoples like non-indigenous peoples have various different ideas, and they're not. One can't, strictly speaking, assume that they're all in line, as it were, with one particular ideology. But nonetheless, we find there is in an inherent understanding that fire is to be understood as an integral part of life on Earth, and that requires us to have a degree of humility in our actions in regard of its presence.
Yeah, I mean, just the image of having orange red skies and O3 maybe in the atmosphere, and strong fires is just, for humans, for our day-to-day existence, we just don't have enough capacity, and not that we have evolved to think on these huge timelines. So yeah, it's just easier for us probably to push that away and just worry about what's going on. But what I realized, I mean, the myth of stealing fire, Prometheus, it is so interesting that that myth of Prometheus and, the gods. I mean, we
Mm.
started from fire, and now, we are probably are becoming, those gods which we were dreaming, in a way that now we actually want to terraform the earth itself. So it's funny that the word is terraforming, but it's now projecting it back. So, geoengineering has been talked about. And we are now coming out of the earth, and the fire was maybe the first thing, as you were mentioning, which is so crucial. The first piece of technology, if you want to call it. And now where we are, probably, it's technical hubris of our species, mostly because we always think that yeah, that's the technology which will, transcend us to the godhood. And but always what happened in the end is that we just then deal with the problem which has been created by the technology, and then create something else. So probably geoengineering would be another thing which would just destroy the core, possibly, because any historian, any design scientist, someone who understand a bit of complex system, generally they are not that positive about
No,
our understanding. Yeah, please.
no. Um, yeah, I mean, I've spoken about the I guess you could call it the arrogance of some to assume that we are the gods now, because the idea that I mean, to look at where that comes from, there was and actually in the movie Prometheus, and it was by no means incidental. There was a line, obviously, so say delivered by the sort of Elon Musk, as it were, of the movie, this tech guru of whom the corporation enabled the exploration that the film revolves around. Um, he said, we are the gods now. We aren't the gods now. What we are is a species that, having evolved from fire, and actually within a period that was actually extremely geologically and climatically stable, the Holocene, that being a period when, yes, we had a few V7 eruptions, and at some periods when we had a flutter, as it were, of V6 eruptions, of which the consequence was volcanic winters, amongst other things, that pushed our species to the limit. But we haven't really, had much in the way of, as it were, environmental hardship as such, or at least not in a sustained context. In that, when major environmental events have happened, they have either been quite brief, and when I say brief, I'm speaking to a period of decades or at most a few hundred years, as opposed to a geological epoch. And they have generally been quite patchy in their expression, in that there have been various places that for one or another reason have been rather less exposed than have others. This is a very different ballgame that we find ourselves in now, in that the scale of the climatic transition, if we're to look at the best and the worst case scenarios, we are looking at a scenario that, from a geological perspective, is taking us out of the stability of the Holocene, and it is taking us into a period in which events that really push our species to its limits are becoming much more frequent, much more severe. And of course, simultaneously to that, we as a species are many times more populous. And the upshot of that is that whereas in times ancient past, we were nomadic, principally we were nomadic because, we've obviously only been settling for a mere 10,000 years. So within and of our history as a species, it's really a brief window of time that we have been, engaged in this thing called civilization. And now we're at a point at which we've built all of these settlements, of which a very many are going to be, and they're right in the firing line of major environmental events. And of course, the thing about these events, and this is really sort of pointing to some of the truths, as it were, in some of the ancient mythologies. We all know of the plagues of Egypt, and we all know of the narratives that essentially suggest that, one event was followed by another, and it all came back to human sin. Now, I'm not a religious person, but what I will say is that there are some truths within and of these ancient myths. And the reason for that, or the reason that they're speaking to truths, is that there are indeed correlations between certain classes of environmental events. So, for example, if you look back at the history of plagues, particularly the bubonic plague, it becomes very much evident that there are correlations with shifts in climate. And of course, the reason for that is it's actually very logical. It is because as and when the likes of droughts are created, it displaces species, which in turn displaces the pathogens that those species carry. And when those species come into contact with humans, out breaks a pandemic, which of course are worsened in a drought or in a period of environmental crisis, because of course we as a species are more vulnerable in that when we are physiologically we are starved, as it were, if we're in a famine, or if, for any reason our immune system is suppressed, then we are more likely to succumb to the pandemic. So we tend to see couplings of environmental crises, pandemics, and all sorts of other things. It doesn't rain, but it pours. And we're now in an era in which, these things are all converging, they're all coming to a head. Fire is right at the heart of that, in that, as we speak, there are not thousands of now dead, tinder dry, ready to combust trees out there. There are tens of millions. And this has been known for some time. And this is why, for example, the extreme fires in California of the last few years were anticipated. They weren't a surprise event, not to the fire science community. It was there, it was written, it was very clear in the data. We are going to get extreme fires. And what the data is now saying, we are going to get more extreme fires. And the fires are not going to be contained just to California. They're going to be breaking out elsewhere. But of course, as I said, it never rains, but it pours, because the fires in of themselves, they then burn off the biomass, which in turn increases the probability of flooding and of debris falls and of various other geological failings. And so, we have that going on. Then, of course, we have the fact that the Greenland and the Antarctic, the polar ice caps are melting at a faster rate than some had anticipated. I say some because, again, in the worst case trajectories, the rates that we're now seeing were there. They were forecast within those trajectories. And so sea levels are rising. And, this is all going on. And this is the big wake-up call. This is the thing that says, you know what? Humans, you have so much capacity, but you are not the gods of this planet. There are forces that are innumerably bigger than are you. And actually, it's all relative, because, of course, if we were to sort of step back from planet Earth and we were to step out into the universe, we find there are yet bigger events. Of which one, of course, would be a solar storm. How many individuals have pondered the fact that at any point, and we would have relatively little notice. We might, goodness me, have at most 24 hours, if that, notice of a major solar storm event, which, if it struck at the precisely right time, we'd be incredibly unfortunate for this to happen, but if it struck at just the right time, when the planet is in a particular orbit to the sun, at a particular proximity, on a particular axis, and in a particular season, then you might not be looking at, what we've seen in the past, wherein, for example, in Quebec, there was a solar storm that knocked out a number of the communications because, of course, it created, amongst other things, electrical surges. You could see half the planet, or possibly even more, have their entire electrical structure, their internet, their comms, their utilities, bang, knocked out.
Yeah.
And, of course, with that, you could simultaneously have firestorms, because what happens when you have electrical surges on power cables? Well, you get sparks. What happens when sparks hit in dry season? You get fires. So, these are the realities, in that we don't know how bad things might get, but we certainly know that things are getting a lot more challenging than they have been.
True.
And so now is the time that we fundamentally, as a species, have a choice. We either accept we're not the gods, and these are the things that we actually need to confront, or, we try and build big walls, and we try and kid ourselves that, we can we can insulate ourselves from forces that are immeasurably greater than our we.
Yeah, I mean, this one freaks me out the most, the solar flare, definitely. And this is not even something which could, like, it has happened 60 million years ago or something. This thing has happened 100 years ago, and it's a very, as you said, it's a blip. Like 10,000 years is a blip, and even 500 years is literally just a blip since maybe industrial revolution. And yeah,
Mm,
the prospect of solar flare and all of our communication, all of our data in the cloud, hypothetically,
mm.
and electronic grid. I just don't understand that. I don't understand at this point, to be very honest, that if we are just keep on going and keep on reproducing and keep on consuming, I mean, where, and without actually realizing and paying respect to the place we are and the power, as you said, exists, like outside of just our tiny echoey egos. I mean, where do you think it would lead? I mean, is there any other place than just driving us off the cliff? If there is, I mean, it would be great to find out. But just a very simple introspection would
Well, I
reveal
think
that.
what I'm seeing at the moment is actually, again, I mean, history does repeat itself. It really, we like to imagine that ours is the capacity to build utopia, to build afresh. That's an ongoing narrative in human culture. But when you look back, you find that the same patterns, the same scenarios, they manifest time and again. And we see it right now. And that before I was speaking about the fact that the pandemic has brought out both the absolute best and the absolute worst in many people. And in that sense, we're seeing a bifurcation of society. Now, this isn't just happening ethically and morally in terms of the way in which people choose to respond, in that some people are saying, well, mine is the responsibility to help my fellow man as much as I can, and obviously, as and where they can, to help the environment. At the other end of the spectrum, we have those people that are completely out for themselves and that have absolutely no concern for their fellow man. And then we have people that are kind of in between. But actually, in business, when you look at what's happening in the business world right now, in response to the pandemic, we have they that have acknowledged that if they want to basically ensure that they're going to have a business 24 months from now, they need to reevaluate what are the new risks, what are the new opportunities, and what is my capacity, what is my business's capacity to adapt to this. And on the one hand, we're seeing people that are being very proactive and they are essentially developing new facets to their business in order that they adapt to this new scenario, while also retaining the flexibility so that, whichever way this swings at the end of it, they've got a bit of leeway. At the other end of the spectrum, we find they of whom it is the assumption that this situation will come to a close within a controllable period. It will be not the circumstances that will set the agenda, but it will be us. We will be able to say, well, in the fashion of Trump, we'll have shut this down by X date, we'll have shut this down by Christmas or whenever it might be. And that after that, there's just the assumption they can just go back. They can just go back to how things were. And so, be it in business or personally, we all have a choice. We can all either accept, well, there are things that are shifting now, and we can take it upon ourselves to look at that shift and to see how we might adapt, or we can be belligerent and we can say, nope, I'm not going to accept change, and I'm just going to stick here in the mud. I'm just going to carry on doing what I was doing. And so I think it's a mixed picture. And although I'm using the analogy of, business persons or individuals, this is happening at a global scale. On the one hand, we have nations that are, doing their best to try and adapt to the circumstance. We have the opposite, and it's a very, very mixed picture. And so my concern now is, well, it's firstly, which of these two which of these two narratives is going to win out, because ultimately we're in a tug of war, and I'm not absolutely sure, who is going to win that war right now.
Yeah.
And also the fact that we don't know what's going to come up behind this. We can only speculate, and we could get lucky. I mean, it could be that, hey, 12 months from now, we're out of the pandemic, we've got a vaccine, it's been developed, it's been deployed, and we're all, rolling along with ease. Or on the other hand, to again look at the complexity of Earth systems, the fact that there are lower emissions, of course, means that there are, amongst other things, fewer clouds and fewer aeroplane trails and so forth. And that in turn has affected the atmosphere. And one of the things, again, I read actually last week was that we're now seeing meteorologists and climatologists in turn warn that the probability of flooding will be higher this year. And so now we've got to think about, well, what's going to happen if not only are we dealing with a pandemic, but we're dealing with higher than average flooding in this year. And it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly messy. And so that is why I'm not pessimistic, but I very much walk straight down the line, in that I don't allow myself to get too optimistic. I don't allow myself to get too down in the mouth. I just look at all this stuff going on and think, well, how are we going to try and walk the middle line here and expose ourselves not to the bias, which is so easy when you shut down your blinkers and you're not looking at the full picture.
You have come to the end of the first part of our conversation. If you are interested, another part is also available on the website, so please check that out.